It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Yes, we'll talk about Graham Platner and that Maine Senate race to begin today, but we'll also put it in the context of the midterm elections generally. Coming up, we'll play two clips of other Democratic primary populists, and I'll tell you what printed slogans they chose to put behind them in their recent TV interview shots and why that matters. And we'll play a clip of House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, who may or may not be on the wrong side of history right now. Joining me for it all is Astead Herndon, host and editorial director at Vox. The previous times he was on, as many of you may remember, and you may know his work directly from this, was when he was a national political reporter for the New York Times and host of their electoral politics podcast, The Run-Up. He was there from 2018 until last year. He's always done such a great job talking to voters around the country, not just politicians. Same Astead Herndon, new platform, his column and podcast for Vox are called America Actually, and he lives in Brooklyn, actually. Astead, always good to have you in your reporting and analysis. Welcome back to WNYC.
Yay, thank you for having me. I love doing the show, Brian.
So as we speak, Graham Platner has not yet dropped out of the Senate race. Maybe by the time some of our listeners are hearing this on the podcast later in the day, not on the live radio show, he will have. All indications are that he will. With all the other stuff swirling around him before this, why only now is he reconsidering his candidacy? And why only now populist leaders like Bernie Sanders and Zohran Mamdani calling on him to drop out?
Well, the short answer is a new piece of information or a new story. We have 48 hours ago, Politico reported that an ex-girlfriend explicitly accused Graham Platner of rape and sexual assault. You had another story from the Washington Post last night saying having another ex-girlfriend say that he removed condoms during sexual intercourse, another act of sexual assault. Now, Graham Platner has denied any non-consensual behavior, but even in his acknowledgement, he said he was taking time to reflect on his campaign. And I think because the latest stories have included, corroboration, people at the time kind of speaking to it. And I saw a Jake Tapper interview where the woman who was speaking in the Politico article talked about how conflicted she was because she shares Graham Platner's views. I think all of those things have made these allegations come with increased weight and credibility and has caused that shift of what you're talking about. You immediately had his congressional endorsers step away from him, folks like Ro Khanna. You had also the DSCC, the Democrats' national campaign arm, say that they will not invest another dollar in this race if Graham Platner stays on the ballot. And all of this has a deadline because Maine Democratic Party has a clause in there where if he drops out before July 13th, that's on Monday, they will be able to add a new candidate on the ballot before July 27th. And so that's why there has been such a kind of coordinated effort. But as you say, he has not dropped out. And I think a lot of us thought that would have already happened by now. And I think it speaks to some of the leverage that campaign thinks it still has in trying to shape the possible replacements.
Yeah. Just looking back a little bit over the Platner story, and then I have a voter analysis question for you if you have something on the ground, and this is gender related. There was the tattoo sometimes associated with the Nazis, sexting with other women while married, and a New York Times report last month on another former girlfriend. There were several women quoted in that article, but in particular another former girlfriend who said Platner could be rough with her. I'm quoting from the Times article now, could be rough with her, leaving her shaken and sometimes afraid, unquote, from the Times. And granted, that woman had gone on to work on Republican campaigns raising credibility issues, but, there were feminists warning he is not okay before the new allegation. And yet there were many populists, we certainly had callers and texters to this show, who didn't want to hear it, who didn't want to see someone who seemed to have the right political values taken down based on those things from the past. So my question to you is, did you do any on-the-ground reporting or see any indicating a gender divide among Democrats in Maine about Platner before this week?
Yeah, I mean, we had looked at focus groups in Maine, and so we had seen some of that gender divide come out. But I think what you're saying is important for a lot of people. It did not take this latest report to kind of see the character indictment of Platner clearly. There were the deleted Reddit posts that had kind of explicitly misogynistic comments. There was obviously the tattoo that you mentioned, and the clear kind of timeline mismatch there. The candidates, to me, kind of clearly knew about this before. We kind of had reporting and evidence that he did, but was not kind of saying so. Was very evasive about that question. And then obviously there was there was the New York Times report recently that had, I think, a group of people vocally expressing their displeasure with the Platner candidacy. So much so that I think there is a lot of questions fair to ask about, a group from the left that blew through some warning signs very clearly. But I've asked them about some of this stuff. I remember asking, not necessarily, I don't want to, talk about this incident specifically and compare it to previous scandals, but I'm used to hearing the left say that they don't care about someone's individual previous transgressions more than their current ideology. We just interviewed a prominent Platner supporter, Emma Vigeland of Majority Report, on this question, and we're going to put out something later today. And that was the kind of the argument she made about looking through those previous red flags. But, I do think it's a question of vetting. The establishment, for all of their ideological mismatch with the Democratic base, they do go through a process that sometimes weeds some of this out. And I think we should also say organizations like New York DSA often, have longer term relationships with elected officials and have a more formalized process of choosing candidates. Graham Platner wasn't chosen like that. He was kind of recruited by an individual firm, and I think he existed in a vacuum because people's anger and backlash at a Democratic leadership that they thought chose a candidate that didn't match with their values. He existed in that void. But I do think it now shows the perils of kind of plucking from nowhere, because some of this stuff, I think, could have been come out earlier. And I think certainly some are asking, why didn't it? But I also think, to your point, the where there is smoke and the consistency of scandal, a lot of people already saw a person unbefitting of office before this week. But can I just say one point on
Sure.
the voter question? We had consistently heard, even from people in Maine, that they felt that sexual assault allegation was a red line. And so they were kind of giving Platner a sense of grace or deference on the story he was telling himself about personal change, about growth, about PTSD. And there was, I think, a willingness to hear that. And I think we can talk about why maybe, some people are given more grace on those questions than others.
Well,
But
maybe
there was clear, even
PTSD
from,
stemming from military service, right? Would be one
yes,
of those
yes,
reasons.
100%. That was one thing that he said consistently in his campaign, is that he had had kind of dark periods, particularly struggled with abuse after his military service. And I think a lot of people were sympathetic to that story. But we had heard from voters that an allegation of sexual assault was a red line, and that was before this week. And so I think it's clear, even in the reaction, that that's not just true from the elected officials, but also from a volunteer base of Plattners that has felt lied to also.
On what would come next, assuming he drops out, do they have anyone with a similar populist cred who might excite Democratic turnout in November, like Platner apparently would have before all this stuff started surfacing?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question right now. You have the kind of New York DSA put their thumb on the scale. There's a candidate, Troy Jackson, they've been promoting. But, Platter wasn't technically a DSA candidate. He had been aligned with the left and others. But I think there's a lot of kind of younger Democrats who are going to try to throw their hat in the ring. One of the things I think is important to know is the Maine Democratic Party last night put out a video saying that they are committed to a public and open process. There's been reporting that they're thinking about something like a kind of mini primary or
Uh,
or one debate. But they said that Plattner's, is putting his thumb on the scale, and they want that to happen after he drops out. And so that seems to be the point of contention about where those commitments are coming from. But I think that already shows a difference between the kind of closed process we saw from Democrats in 2024. It shows to me some lessons the state party is taking to kind of actively say where they are in that decision process and say, we are committed to some level of voter input.
right. The leadership anointed Kamala Harris when Biden dropped out, and we see how that worked out. We will stipulate that Maine is crucial to either party's hopes of winning a Senate majority in November. So some context on statewide election totals in Maine. Democratic presidential candidates have been carrying Maine for a long time, including Obama, Biden, and yes, Kamala Harris in 2024. But Republican Susan Collins has kept winning her reelection bids. The last time in 2020, Senate terms are 6 years, when Biden won the presidential majority there. How come?
Yeah, I mean, Susan Collins has had some, like, I think, real stickiness with Maine electorate. I think she has told a legacy of experience and service. She's created distinctions and key moments between her and Trump. I remember covering that race against Sarah Gideon, where there was a lot of focus, particularly on her support of Donald Trump's Supreme Court justices, but she was able to withstand some of that. And so, part of the argument the Platner camp, or I would say those supportive of him, have tried to make is that the Democrats have had several bites at the Susan Collins apple with a more traditional or moderate candidate. And the goal, and I think the message of Platner was not just one of ideology, but of electability, saying that kind of going outside that traditional contrast was going to be the way that they can finally, finally defeat her. But if Democrats don't kind of find a way to unite around a candidate in Maine, their path to Senate majority obviously gets much harder. It has to go through states that are thought to be more difficult, like Texas or Alaska, and so this was. And the warning signs have been there. In the New York Times polling that came out in the last couple of weeks, it was clear that Platner, even before this week, was running behind Democrats in those swing states in the Senate. And the environment largely is one that is good for Democrats. Donald Trump is very unpopular. We feel, even in our reporting and in polling, a real sense of like a backlash that could be bubbling up for November. But it wasn't that Graham Platner, outside of the primary context, was clearly seizing on that. And so there is a way that this switch, because it is thought to be happening, in the next week or so, allows Democrats to refocus the race on Susan Collins, because it had become a referendum on Graham Platner. And so that may put them in a better position electorally, because as you mentioned, because as you mentioned, Collins has been a frequent target of Democrats and has withstood that several times before.
So listeners, any comments or questions for Astead Herndon from Vox? Anyone in Maine? Any women who've had opinions one way or another before this week's rape allegation, which is largely considered credible, partly because of other things that this woman said in the earlier New York Times article, and now says she feels comfortable enough and compelled to say the rest, the hardest part? Or anyone else on the Platner saga? Or anyone on the state of the Democratic Party after the various New York, Colorado, and other primary results, which we'll get to, 212-433-WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692. And staying on Susan Collins, here's a text that reflects what I'm sure a lot of listeners are thinking. Senator Susan Collins put Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. And to this listener, I don't know if a lot of people are thinking of it exactly like this, but this listener asks, would it be some kind of justice if Graham Platner replaces her, writes Carol in Brooklyn. But yeah, there's this record of Collins voting largely with Trump on his most controversial Senate bills. There's that, even though she did vote to convict him on his January 6th related impeachment charges. And 2020, her last election, was 2 years after Collins voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh as a Supreme Court justice, and that, of course, was before Kavanaugh voted on the bench to throw out Roe versus Wade, which was always a concern about him. Here's what Susan Collins said in 2018 as she was deciding to vote to confirm.
We talked about whether he considered Roe to be settled law. He said that he agreed with what Justice Roberts said at his nomination hearing, in which he said that it was settled law.
Ouch. And I saw a clip of her from just recently where she kind of ducked a reporter trying to ask her if she had regrets about that vote to confirm. So now that Roe and the abortion rights it granted have been undone, has that issue become much more salient and made her more vulnerable in 2026?
Well, I do think it, that is a huge issue. And I would only say, though, that the focus on Collins, I think, really will be also her relationship with Trump overall, rubber stamping an unpopular agenda. I think a president that has been focused on priorities misaligned with his 2024 promises. Now, I think that the Kavanaugh vote is the signature vote of the larger story of Susan Collins, frankly, acquiescence to the Trump project. And so that vote becomes the focus. And I think at the time, I remember when she said that kind of comment about settled law, like, it was taken with such reaction because a lot of folks saw that Roe moment coming. And it was hard to believe that she did, that she would kind of defer to Kavanaugh's word of good faith there. But all I would say, in addition to that, is that we saw Democrats really ride of the backlash to the overturning of Roe in the 2022 midterms. And that was really kind of a successful way for them to kind of pitch themselves to particularly battleground state voters. I think this year is going to be a lot of focus on affordability, a lot of focus on Donald Trump's actions, and that the story of like internal Democratic Party fights that's been defining the last 6 months might not exactly where we might be come November. And so Roe plays a piece of that, and I think Collins' votes plays a piece of that. But I imagine the biggest a controlling factor for the midterms will be the actions of Donald Trump and how much Susan Collins has helped pave the way for a project that people have largely soured on.
One kind of footnote to the Platner story is that Zohran Mamdani had previously said he was staying out of Democratic primaries outside New York and focusing on his job as mayor other than New York races, calling for Platner to drop out as his first public statement about a race this year in another state where the issue is now internal to the Democratic Party. Do you think that indicates simply that this is a unique issue, or also that after his successful primary endorsements in New York and now these other socialist or populist wins around the country after his for mayor, that he's decided to start stepping out more into, trying to establish a national leadership role?
Well, I think specific to Mamdani, there's a lot at play. I do think that he is seen as a national leader or voice on Democratic Party. So I imagine even as he's tried to keep his endorsements limited to New York, he will get questions about the larger party direction, and he plays into it in an ideological sense. So I don't think that that can be separated from the individuals attached to those beliefs. I also think it's that the Platner allegations are a moral question. I imagine that's why he felt somewhat compelled to respond here. But Platner and Mamdani also share a couple key consultants, which has linked them in political circles in a way that I imagine also it was played into Mamdani's calculus about whether weighing in on this specific race. But, he has really played his cards local to the city. And we obviously saw that pay off in the New York City primary. But, there are other midterms candidates across the country, Abdul El Sayed in Michigan, who are also kind of asked about kind of Platner and kind of a willingness to kind of call out him to resign and how quick that came. And there were folks upset with Bernie Sanders that he kind of took a day or so and kind of just came out with that later. So, I do think there are going to be a fair amount of people who feel like they saw warning signs of a person who was misfit for office, and they want to ask, like, who knew what when. And I also think that playing a little bit into this is parts of the party that feel like the left, media, or other places have kind of deferred to, I would say, a Democratic bro-y culture, and have not kind of heard people who have called that out for a while. And so, I think about even when I was reporting on Mamdani's rise, I would hear from women electeds, even folks in DSA, who would say that they felt that, imagine if they changed positions on defund the police or things like that, and feel as if there were parts of that movement that were really deferential to just a certain type of guy. And so I feel like a lot of that is at play when we talk about the active kind of direction fight among the Democratic Party right now. But I think that's a little separate from the moral question of Platner's actions, which has been a clear-eyed, I think largely a universal reaction to, no matter your quarter of the party.
Katie in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC with Astead Herndon from Vox. Hi, Katie.
Hi. I just wanted to push back, and I think your guest just sort of pointed this out, on this idea that Platner's platform, because it was coming from the left, meant he was the first choice of people on the left side of the party. He wasn't. Most people were looking at that saying, most of the political folks on the left that I'm in contact with in Brooklyn felt that anyone who figures out, even if he didn't know to start with, that he's got a Nazi tattoo, takes it off before he runs for office. Anyone who, with any grain of sense, would have done something about that before any of this started. And that, combined with all the evidence of his bad decision-making over the years, made him a terrible candidate. I don't think he was a popular candidate on the left outside of Maine.
Well, outside
we're
of Maine,
not in Maine.
But of course he's running in
Exactly.
Maine, not in Brooklyn. And remember, he did win a primary. He wasn't anointed by, the party bosses or anything like that. He won a primary.
Yeah,
so he was their favorite. He was a lot of people's favorite candidate. Katie, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was going to say he was a lot of people's favorite candidate. They really want to get rid of Susan Collins. I understand that. And there is a lot of hunger for a little less narrow party line interest in Maine, and I think elsewhere as well, where folks are more interested in seeing their policies addressed than they are in winner take, vote blue or die.
Katie, thank you very much. Jennifer in Harlem, you're on WNYC. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for calling in.
Yes, good morning, Brian, and thank you so much for taking my call. I have called in about this issue on several occasions. I've become so cynical in my view that, unfortunately, I think the individuals, particularly the men who vie for power or are in power, are guilty of transgressions like this more than we even know. And I think that Platner is putting forth a remarkably important progressive platform. I think that Susan Collins is disgustingly hypocritical. And I think that it's the issue of accountability. I think that if men who are accused of these things, and I don't doubt, I'm sorry to say, I don't doubt that he's guilty. I think the issue is, and this included my view on Cuomo, just be accountable. I think if it was that put forth, I think they would be viewed very differently, because I'm sorry to say this goes on all the time, and I just think that we have to be realistic about this. I mean, again, look at who we have in the White House. I mean, he was voted in twice and has a very long history of predation against women. So let's look at our society and recognize we have made allowances. And in this regard, I think we do have a candidate who is very strong on issues that we care about progressively. And maybe if he is willing to be accountable, we should make allowances for him. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you very much. Although I guess a risk to Graham Platner or anyone else in a position like this, Astead, if they were to say, okay, I did it, that was horrible, it was like the worst thing I ever did in my life, and I'm taking full responsibility for it, but it was X years ago, and I'm moving on now. If somebody were to do that when they're being accused of rape, maybe they put themselves in legal jeopardy, and that's one reason not to. But do you see any chance that Platner, who immediately denied these charges on Monday, we should say, could come out and give something like I just cited as a hypothetical answer? Yes, I did. It was the worst thing I did. It was years ago. I moved on even from this. I ask your forgiveness. I'm going to be your best representative, women, men, anybody else.
The short answer is no. I think that that's the story Platner already did tell about about other things that had come up
Right.
in the lead up to this. That's the story he told about texting outside of his marriage, or even the allegations, that were not, as specific as rape and sexual assault that came out from ex-girlfriends before that. That's the story of change that I think voters had already bought into. We don't have not seen Democrats as Republicans have, excuse explicit or corroborated, allegations of sexual assault as, Republican base has done with Donald Trump. Like, that hasn't really been the same on the Democratic side, nor I think can we expect that. We also have seen the institutional support collapse for him. But what I do think is a kind of changing, what I do think it's important that one of the callers kind of mentioned is like the question of the veracity of Platner support in the first place, I think cannot be separated from the fact that the Democratic establishment did have a chosen candidate in this race, Governor Janet Mills. The DSCC did try to put kind of their thumb on the scale and paint Platner as a misogynistic or a kind of a figure before that in the primary, and it did not land. Voters prioritized like the views that sort of Platner held, or were simply just not in to Janet Mills as a candidate. And so we see that as a consistent story across the country, a kind of Democratic leadership that has not yet figured out where its base is. And I think the people like Platner have existed in the void that has left. And so that includes some candidates I think Democrats are happy about, like a Mamdani. But that also includes some folks who have existed in that void that I think they're somewhat regretting in the Platners. But that's the leverage that they're trying to use right now, is to make sure that they feel like those views that did win a primary, a Democratic primary, overwhelmingly are represented in what happens next.
Some texts that are coming in. One says, I hope someone will get through representing my point of view. I'm truly disappointed that so many people are falling into this easily anticipated, obvious trap. As soon as I heard the news yesterday, I immediately sent Platner's campaign a donation. I just hope he's able to tough it out and that the voters of Maine will turn out to be smarter than all those others that never took the trouble to follow this story properly all along. So I don't know that there are many people left in that camp who think, that things that are surfacing are politically motivated. I think at very least, Astead, because there are so many of them, right? There's a where there's smoke, there's fire aspect to this. There was the Times reporting on multiple women from last week. The one, even though she went on to be a Republican political operative, they looked at her diaries from the time where the alleged stuff took place, the Times reported, and, where there's multiple charges, credibility gathers, right? Then there's somebody who writes, Jennifer, the last caller, makes a good point. U.S. presidents had slaves. And then, in contrast to that, is the caller saying that all a male candidate has to do is be accountable for committing rape, and that's sufficient to continue their campaign, and we should elect them? So there's a variety of things. In.
I think that the range of responses, I think, runs the gamut of how I imagine Democrats would react. But there is a base of volunteer support that I think feels both betrayed and lied to, and some of whom may still support him. But, that's why I say it's important that we already had evidence that he was running behind Democratic candidates before this week of scandal. And so there was an electoral penalty that Platner was seemingly paying because of the amount of things that had accumulated. Right. And
but
so
there's
the
timeline. Yes, but the timeline, when you say running behind Democratic candidates, you mean compared to other Democratic nominees in other states, I think. And the timeline is that the New York Times article came out, correct me if I'm wrong, after the primary. So this erosion of support, the tattoo issue is out there, but I think not these multiple allegations that the Times went into detail on, and obviously not this. Is that accurate or not accurate?
I'm pretty sure the Times story came out with a couple days ahead of the primary.
Oh, okay.
It was right. It was right as it was heading into it, I believe. But I do think it's fair to say, that they, what information did voters have? And like, I don't think the Platner campaign can use the margin of their primary victory as full evidence of a groundswell movement, particularly if many of those same people feel like your actions have betrayed their values. Also, Platner had said himself that he did not, that there would not be new allegations coming out and things like that. And so I think there is a question of accountability, of credibility that's inherent to this. But there's also infrastructure. Like if the DSCC is saying they will not invest a dollar in the Maine Senate race if he remains the nominee, that's a debilitating loss. And so there is also, the way he is being squeezed institutionally, and that is where, those establishment levers matter.
And another listener writes, I cannot imagine a female candidate making it as far as Graham Platner made it if she had Nazi tattoos and a long history of crappy behavior while blackout drunk, having her down payment of her house paid for by her dad and being unfaithful to her husband. Can you imagine that person being taken seriously as a candidate for Senate? So there's another
totally
comparison.
True. Like, I think that's an important point to make.
So let's leave this part of the conversation right there, and after a break, move from Maine to Michigan and talk about the Democratic Senate primary there and some more national context, especially with the results in Colorado last week, as we continue with Astead Herndon, now with Vox. Yes, this is the same Astead Herndon you remember from his years at the New York Times. He does a column and podcast now for Vox as a national political reporter and editor called America Actually. We continue actually after this. Brian Lehrer on WNYC with Astead Herndon from Vox. Maybe we can call this comic relief. Instead of comic relief as dessert at the end of the segment, we'll put it here in the middle. After the Platner rape allegation broke on Politico on Monday, former Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, remember him, said this, comparing the two parties on Fox.
The one thing I know about Republicans, when we had a very bad candidate and found out, we didn't vote for that person. Right. We walked away.
For better or for worse.
Yeah. When Matt Gaetz came forward, we got rid of him.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, when Matt Gaetz was nominated for Attorney General, maybe. But in general, Kevin McCarthy saying when Republicans had a bad candidate, suggesting on the issue of sexual misconduct, they walked away. Of course, there's that little matter of the presidential candidate. What was his name again in 2016? And most relevantly in 2024, who had been found by a jury before that to have committed sexual abuse of E. Jean Carroll. And then all the other Republicans walked away from him, right? And of course, you'll remember that after January 6th, Kevin McCarthy, as Speaker of the House, went to Mar-a-Lago to say, we're all good here. So there's that. Just saying. All right, let's move from Maine to Michigan and talk about the Democratic Senate primary there on August 4th. Another one that's considered completely crucial to which party takes the Senate in November. And again, we have a more populist versus less populist primary. Former public health official Dr. Abdul El-Sayed leading in the polls versus Congresswoman Haley Stevens. They had a contentious debate last night. Here's El-Sayed in a recent MS Now interview on, you might say, the set of economic issues that populists are most activated nationally about, including in his campaign stops, he says, around the state of Michigan.
And no matter where you go, people are deeply frustrated by the fact that they can't afford a dignified life. They're worried about somebody getting sick and having to hit that $6,000 deductible. They're worried about being able to pay just for the meat to be able to grill up on July 4th. They're worried about being able to afford the utilities. And we're speaking to what it looks like to take corporate hands off of our politics so that our politics can actually be about trying to make our lives more affordable, standing with unions, guaranteeing health care through Medicare for all.
Through Medicare for All, Abdul El-Sayed on MS Now, and behind him in that shot, he was displaying a book called Medicare for All, A Citizen's Guide. And hold that image of that book in your head, folks, as we play a clip of the winner of that headline-making Democratic House primary in Colorado last week, Millet Quiros. This clip is after a reporter's question about Quiros saying she won't support Hakeem Jeffries for Speaker or Democratic leader unless he stops accepting PAC money.
At the end of the day, a lot of the victories that we are seeing across this country are so important because what we are showing is that the fight is with the oligarchy. The fight is with the corruption that we are seeing in government. And we have to work together to be able to find the solutions necessary to get that done. My commitment to not voting in any leadership that takes corporate PAC money is the standard that I think we should be setting as a party. If we want to be winning again, corruption is a number one issue for voters. And we should be setting the standard for what a truly functioning democracy looks like. And that means getting money out of our politics.
Democratic House nominee in Colorado, Millet Quiros, and behind Quiros in her shot was a campaign sign she placed that said, "Housing is a human right." So, Astead, housing is a human right as a slogan in her shot, Medicare for all is a slogan in El Sayed's TV backdrop. Does that tell us something about where the energy is in the party on affordability this election cycle?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're not seeing signs about issues that Progressive Lane was talking about 4 or 5 years ago, things like climate change or things like more social cultural issues. And I feel like the focus on affordability has been universal throughout the party, but has been really defined by a populist lane that I think grew out of certainly the Bernie Sanders campaigns, but I think really out of the landmark Mamdani win in New York City. We actually talked to Greg Cesar, the Congressional Progressive Chair for America, actually. And, it was about this affordability agenda that progressives were putting out. And yes, it's tied to things like Medicare for all and kind of broader structural questions. But, it sounds a lot about, it's a lot about lowering grocery prices. It's a lot about tax structures. And I think that leaning into that us versus them message is something that they feel like is better suited on the affordability question than the other lanes that I think the left was playing in years ago. So that's a clear shift than we saw even from the 2022 midterms, when things like abortion rights or others were a much bigger focus of that line.
And another issue in Michigan, as it has been around the country, and how it ties into corporate PAC money generally, is U.S. monetary support for the Israeli military and support for a one-state versus two-state solution and AIPAC's influence in American politics. In the Michigan debate last night, Haley Stevens reaffirmed that she is for a two-state solution. Here's El Sayed on MS Now last week stating his differing position in response to the host's question and also bringing it to his framing of military aid for there versus local needs at home.
At the end of the day, we have this debate here in America about what we ought to be doing over there. But I believe in equal rights to peace, dignity, and self-determination for all people. And the decision about what happens in the future to create the ultimate peace should be between the Palestinian people and Jewish Israeli people about how they want to live moving forward. And so it's not actually our decision to make. And I'll tell you this, the question about Israel having a right to exist is separate from whether or not Israel has the right to our tax dollars. And too many politicians spending huge amounts of money in this race through AIPAC think that our best use of our tax dollars is to be sent over there to drop bombs over there, rather than to invest in healthcare and schools and housing here. And I happen to believe, as the next senator from Michigan, that I want my tax dollars spent in Michigan.
Abdul El Sayed on MS Now, and obviously support for Israeli military aid to Israel is changing in the Democratic Party. I saw a NORC Associated Press poll this morning, Astead, that shows Zohran Mamdani with a net favorable rating among Jewish voters nationally, 44 to 39% positive over negative, while Benjamin Netanyahu has a huge net negative of 59% unfavorable, just 32% favorable. And there was an article in the Jewish newspaper, The Forward, in April, just as another indication, with the headline, "Most American Jews oppose AIPAC spending in Democratic primaries," survey finds. And that was a survey done by the progressive Jewish group J Street. But The Forward reported the majority of American Jews oppose the pro-Israel lobby AIPAC spending funds raised from Republican donors in Democratic primaries, according to a new survey released at that time. So what's changing there among Democrats and even Jewish Democrats? And granted, Mamdani did not win a majority of Jewish voters in New York, but this poll on how he's perceived nationally by Jewish voters is really interesting, if these are meaningful indicators.
No, it's a huge sea shift among the Democratic Party and among the base. And I think that it sometimes has been localized to groups like young people or the left or pockets of the country like Dearborn. But in my reporting, we have heard a shift around the sentiment around the U.S. relationship to Israel or backlash to a perceived genocide in Gaza consistently over the last couple of years. I've heard that in the suburbs of Wisconsin leading up to 2024 from a North Carolina voter who was deciding to sit out and not vote for Democrats for the first time in her life because they found it morally objectionable. In the 2025 profile I did of Mamdani for the Times Magazine, there was a quote from Patrick Gaspard, an advisor that I think is important, which talked about the issue as a moral litmus test for voters understanding that you would follow through on things like affordability or things like breaking up corporate power, but that this was a way to show that you kind of lived in the same reality as everybody else. And so I think that you've seen that play out through some of the Democratic primaries, and that's not, I think the poll you're showing, I think it kind of breaks up some of the assumptions about which groups that apply to. But I'll just say, hey, we were at Trump's UFC event in Washington, D.C. for an episode of the show that was focused on young men and Gen Z men and how they were feeling about the second term Trump and what they wanted going forward. And what we heard from those groups was that they want a candidate who was going to rethink America's relationship with Israel. And that, I think, was a surprising takeaway from some. I think just speaks to the pervasiveness of the sea change, particularly in the Democratic electorate. But I would say we see it in traces of Republican electorate also.
But wait, I know you got to go, but your latest article or podcast had the headline. I don't have it in front of me, but it was something like Gen Z bros are trading in their MAGA hats. Is Israel the main reason?
It was one of the reasons. It wasn't the main reason. The main reason was gas prices, affordability, kind of the same concerns we hear about Trump not focusing on inflation like he promised. That was the first thing. The second thing I would say that came up was Epstein, to be honest with you, about like a moment in which they felt as if Trump, who they kind of thought of as a guy fighting for the outsiders or seems like a member of the club. And I think the lack of transparency on that issue was a break with some of those groups. And then the third thing that came up was the Iran war and America's relationship with Israel. And so it was definitely one of the consistent policy things that we heard, so much so that even conservatives were acknowledging that Trump has a lot to do to repair his relationship with that part of an energized base that they were really kind of proud of. But it was policy driven. But I would say those three policies rather than that just one.
Astead Herndon, now host and editorial director at Vox. Thanks so much for coming on today. Know you're busy. Thank you very, very much.
No, thank you for having me.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.
The United States is about to mark its 250th anniversary.
And so on the Global Story podcast from the BBC, we're telling surprising tales of American influence on the world stage and in ordinary people's lives all across the globe.
We have this ability to export our story, and a lot of people have bought it.
I feel like the American dream is alive but not well.
From the BBC, it's the United States at 250.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts or find us on YouTube.